Introduction. The modern age was a time of transformation, a period of history that spanned less than 500 years, yet one could argue it had more of an impact on our societies and cultures than any periods that came before or after. The modern historic period, also known as the Modern Age or Modern Era, occurred following the Middle Ages and can be further divided into two time periods, the Early Modern Period and the Late Modern Period. The Early Modern Period occurred from 1500 to 1800 and included the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment. Other key events of this period include the French and American Revolutions, the Scientific Revolution, and the spread of European colonialism, resulting in the spread of disease which devastated indigenous populations around the globe. European colonialism relied on the global slave trade and other forms of subjugation and exploitation of the indigenous populations who were unequipped to defend themselves. The late modern era was primarily shaped by a few key historical events that happened in the 19th and 20th centuries. This era then concludes with the end of World War II in 1945. This video will focus on this era, because of how greatly society's perception of disability rapidly changed in this period, but also to highlight, in a broader sense, how societies around the world rapidly and irreparably changed. This will be achieved by further discussing three of the major developments of this period, which include the Industrial Revolution, Eugenics, and the World Wars. Case Study 1: The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was the process of change from an agrarian and handicraft economy to one dominated by industry and machine manufacturing. These technological changes introduced novel ways of working and living and fundamentally transformed society. This process began in Britain in the 1760s and from there spread to other parts of the world. Across Britain, the landscape was altered as industry swept the countryside. Villages and shires gave way to towns and cities interconnected by way of road and rail, and the predominant work for the masses shifted from farming to in the factories. The Industrial Revolution's influence had a few interesting outcomes for the lives of the disabled. Before the 1800s, disability in the working class didn't matter to the upper class as long as one could still contribute on a farm. However, as the upper class became more reliant on an able-bodied working class for working in their factories, the treatment of the disabled changed. Until then, it had been accepted in English society that people with disabilities or illness who needed care and support got it from family, friends, community, and from the medieval era onwards, occasionally by charitable asylums as discussed in the last episode. Now reformers claimed that an asylum would be a safe place where lunatics could be cured and idiots taught. As the medical field grew, so did their optimism for the effectiveness of asylums. At the beginning of the 1800s, a few hundred people were living in 9 small charitable asylums. By 1900, more than 100,000 idiots and lunatics were in 120 county pauper asylums. A further 10,000 were in workhouses. Along with their treatment, the society's views of the disabled rapidly changed. Some examples of these misbeliefs that enabled the actions of these people included: disability was believed to be inherently tied with criminality and unproductive laziness. They also believed that those with an intellectual disability, or as they would define it, feeble-mindedness, had to be isolated from the greater populations so they couldn't spread their affliction to others through contact. As a result of these misbeliefs, standardized physical examination of children in schools across Britain to segregate the disabled and provide further numbers for the asylums. During this period, the lives of the able-bodied were definitely better than the institutionalized, but only marginally, as they worked long hours, in dangerous workplaces for terrible pay. These work conditions resulted in many disabilities that often forced the injured onto the street or into an institution. To explain the motivations of those in the upper class that orchestrated the spread of the asylum model of treatment and lack of workers' rights at this time, it's important to understand that their attitudes were born out of the cutthroat capitalism and classical liberalism that blossomed at that time. These ideologies were in part influenced by the peasant-lord dynamic of a now-dead feudal system and the colonialism that continued to thrive during this time, then blended with the technological advances of industry that enabled financial gain never before possible. This all combined to encourage their callous and cruel attitudes towards those of the lower classes. Although this was a time of suffering for those in the lower classes, as a reaction to their treatment, different socialist movements emerged that focused on improving the lives and conditions for industrial workers. For example, Marxism and utopian socialism both sought to stop the exploitation of the workers by the owners and create more balance in society. At the same time, the idea of labor unions became popular across industrial societies. Workers formed and used unions in order to protest for a variety of things, including shorter hours of work, higher rates of pay, safer working conditions, basic education, and healthcare. These protections evolved into the wide-ranging social services and workforce regulations that we all benefit from today, that help both the disabled and able-bodied alike. Case Study 2. Eugenics. The origins of genetics are inextricably wedded to eugenics. Since Plato suggested the pairing of high-quality parents, and Plutarch described Spartan infanticide, the principles of population control have been in place. But in the time of Victorian industrialization, with an ever-expanding working class, and in the wake of Darwinian evolution, Darwin's half-cousin, Francis Galton, added a scientific and statistical sheen to the deliberate sculpting of society, and he named it eugenics. It was a political ideology that co-opted the very new and immature science of evolution, and came to be one of the defining and most deadly ideas of the 20th century. The eugenics movement successfully encouraged states around the globe to enact policies of forced sterilization on varying, minority demographics based upon various prejudices. Marriage laws and immigration were also heavily influenced by the eugenics movement. Nazi Germany took eugenics to its extreme and disturbing conclusion, but to contextualize a world in which the Nazis could rise to power, we must first understand the devastating global impacts of the eugenics movement from its inception in the 1880s, and then through the early 20th century. The UK came within a whisker of having involuntary sterilization of undesirables as legislation, something that Churchill robustly campaigned for in his years in the Asquith government. In the US, though, eugenics policies were enacted from 1907 until the 1940s in 31 states. An estimated 80,000 people were forcibly sterilized by the state in the name of purification. America had some of the most racist and ableist marriage laws and immigration policies that continued beyond this historical period. Other states around the world with eugenics-inspired policies include Australia. The policy of removing mixed-race Aboriginal children from their parents emerged from an opinion based on eugenics theory in late 19th and early 20th century Australia, that the full-blood Aboriginals would be unable to sustain their numbers, and were doomed to inevitable extinction, unable to compete with the Europeans' so-called superior genetics, as at the time huge numbers of them were in fact dying out, from diseases caught from European settlers and from the effects of colonialism. They believed that erasing their cultural heritage through removal of mixed-race Aboriginal children, to be raised in institutions that indoctrinated them with European culture, would speed up the inevitable, total annihilation of Aboriginal people and their culture. Although these eugenics-inspired policies don't directly involve disability, I think it's a tragic yet valuable example of the world-spanning impacts of this movement as a tool to justify cruel actions of people with power. Japan. Starting in the early 20th century, Japanese governments executed a eugenics policy to limit the birth of children with so-called inferior traits, as well as aiming to protect the life and health of mothers. These policies meant sterilization could be enforced on criminals with genetic predisposition to commit crime, patients with genetic diseases such as total colorblindness, hemophilia, albinism and ichthyosis, and mental affections such as schizophrenia and manic depressiveness, and those with epilepsy. There are many other examples spanning the globe of states legislating policies based on the principles of eugenics, however none compare in scope to the actions of Nazi Germany in the short time they held power. Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler was well known for eugenics programs which attempted to maintain a pure, Aryan race through a series of programs that ran under the banner of racial hygiene. During the 1930s and 1940s, the Nazi regime used forced sterilization on hundreds of thousands of people whom they viewed as mentally ill, an estimated 400,000 between 1934 and 1937. The scale of the Nazi program prompted one American eugenics advocate to seek an expansion of their program, with one complaining that the Germans are beating us at our own game. The Nazis went further, however, murdering tens of thousands of the institutionalized disabled through compulsory euthanasia programs. They also implemented a number of positive eugenics policies, giving awards to Aryan women who had large numbers of children and encouraged a service in which racially pure, single women could deliver illegitimate children. Many of their concerns for eugenics and racial hygiene were also explicitly present in their systematic murder of millions of undesirable people, especially Jewish people, who were singled out for the final solution. This policy led to the horrors seen in the Holocaust. The final solution was the single most devastating ramification of the eugenics movement. The scope and coercion involved in the German eugenics programs, along with a strong use of the rhetoric of eugenics and so-called racial science throughout the regime, created an indelible cultural association between eugenics and the Third Reich in the post-war years. This Nazi association and further developments in genetics led to a sharp decline in the popularity of the eugenics movement. Case study number 3, the World Wars. The two World Wars were the two events of the most death and destruction in human history, and they happened only 2 decades apart. These two events are intrinsically entwined with the history of disability. Starting with World War I. It is generally accepted that 16 million people were killed, 20 million were injured, and of that 28 were permanently disabled from their injuries. When Reconstruction after the war began, the eugenics-inspired beliefs of the time were challenged as soldiers who were considered heroes returned with disabilities. Although the events of the First World War didn't halt the spread of the eugenics movement, it did give birth to new concepts and ideas. These are some of the ways society adapted to their return. There were major advances in plastic surgery and prosthetics. Ex-servicemen with physical and mental damage were treated with new exercise and fitness approaches. Employers were urged to take on disabled workers, and at the same time sheltered employment workplaces sprang up around the world. New housing was built for disabled ex-servicemen. Medicine, in World War I, made major advances in several directions. They went from amputation as the only solution, to being able to transport soldiers to hospital, to disinfect their wounds and to operate on them to repair the damage wrought by artillery. Ambulances, antiseptic, and anesthesia, 3 elements of medicine taken entirely for granted today, emerged from the depths of suffering in the First World War. 70 to 85 million people perished in the Second World War, and unrecorded tens of millions more were left permanently disabled. As the modern historic era technically ends with the end of World War II, I will leave the post-war ramifications to explore in the next episode, but it's worth briefly setting the scene of a world at the end of World War II. As mentioned in the previous case study, the Nazi atrocities sparked outrage for the affected minorities, including the disabled. The end of World War II triggered many developments in the world of disability, including the beginnings of many disability-focused social movements against discrimination and inequality and for social inclusion, community accessibility, and access to work. Alongside World War I, World War II brought about many advances in medicine. Advances in combat surgery saved countless lives. Surgical removal of dead or dying tissue, debridement, reduced the danger of infection, as did the delayed closure of wounds. Surgeons skilled in orthopedics preserved limbs that in previous wars would have been amputated. For the first time, the miracle drug penicillin was widely used to combat infection. By the last 2 years of the war, penicillin was also being mass-produced in the civilian community. Not all wounds are physical. In a previous era, the psychologically wounded suffered from nostalgia during the Civil War and shell shock in World War I. In World War II, this condition was termed combat exhaustion or combat fatigue. The World War I experience of treating men at the front had been successful. However, military psychiatrists and psychologists at the beginning of World War II had to relearn those lessons. Although this combat fatigue wasn't officially recognized as PTSD until 1980, the large numbers of returning veterans that required psychological support, in part, played an important role in the understanding of PTSD. Conclusion. To say the late modern historic period was a time of change is an understatement. The monumental effects of the Industrial Revolution and the World Wars reshaped human history unlike any previous events could have ever done, and these events continue to reverberate through societies and cultures around the globe. This was a historic period that truly unveiled the mask on our capacity for evil, from the European slave trade, the US programs of forced sterilization, up to the Nazis' final solution. In this dark chapter of human history, the depths of humanity's capacity for depravity were dug deeper. However awful it is to ruminate on these events, we have to understand and take the time to learn from our mistakes, if we are to avoid repeating them. And at the same time, juxtaposed to the misery of this time, are the social changes that occurred as a reaction to the events of this period. These social movements and their effects on the disabled living in that time will be explored in the next episode.
Let us know in the comments below what you thought of the episode, and any episode ideas, thoughts or queries are welcome too. Consider subscribing to stay up to date with this ongoing series. Thanks for watching.